Hello, Wobbly Phil here. In the 1950s, BSA was the biggest selling bike brand in the world. Let's just give that a moment to sink in. A British motorcycle manufacturer was once the biggest selling brand in the world. BSA could claim that 1 in 4 bikes sold worldwide was one of theirs. 20 years later, BSA was gone, so effectively were Norton and Triumph. Those small production runs staggered on for a few more years. The question is, what happened in the decade between the middle of the 1960s and the middle of the 1970s that destroyed such a successful industry? Much of what follows is based on reports that were written at the time by people who were in the thick of it. In this first video, I'm going to be tracing the history of the British motorcycle industry up to the middle of the 1960s. Then, in parts 2 and 3, we'll navigate the stormy waters of the late 1960s and 1970s. James Lansdowne Norton is widely regarded as one of the founding fathers of the British motorcycle industry. In 1898, at the age of 29, he founded his business in Birmingham. 15 years earlier, a German immigrant, Siegfried Bettmann, arrived in Coventry, also in the industrial heart of England, and set up what was soon to become his Triumph Cycle Company. The Birmingham Small Arms Company, or BSA, on the other hand, had been going great guns since 1861, but a downturn in the bang-bang business in the 1880s sent them in a different direction, looking for new areas to apply their manufacturing expertise. They began building bicycles, and by 1905 had built a prototype motorcycle. Those 3 firms formed the formidable backbone of British motorcycle manufacturing over the next 8 decades. When the industry was eventually stripped to the bone in 1973, the mechanically recovered meat from these 3 titans was ground down into one evil-smelling rissole called Norton Villiers Triumph. Of course, there were other players. Famous British names like Vincent, Ariel, Royal Enfield, AJS, Sunbeam, Rudge, James and Matchless are some of the venerable marks that spring to mind. Many of them were eventually absorbed into the aimless lump that was Associated Motorcycles, or AMC, which petered out in the 1960s.
£5 million worth of machinery, carefully packed and crated, goes for export.
A harbinger of things to come in the following decade. These small bike companies weren't exactly small fry, but they were more like fish fingers compared to the big battered chip shop cod fillets of BSA, Triumph and Norton. Their individual stories are more or less a microcosm of what happened when the big 3 imploded. So, to simplify this story, I'm going to boil it down to those 3. During the first worldwide kerfuffle, BSA, of course, was supplying mostly guns. Triumph produced something like 30,000 bikes for the Allied effort, going up against its counterpart on the German side, Triumph Motorcycles of Nuremberg. Norton divided its time between motorcycle manufacturing and armaments. Once the fuss was over, all 3 continued through the roaring 20s and even survived the Great Depression of the 1930s, although Triumph had to sell off its German subsidiary and its bicycle division and eventually its car division too. BSA had to stop paying shareholders dividends for a bit. During this period, bike companies also had to face off the assault on the sidecar combination business, from the cheap small cars that were becoming ever more popular, not least because there was a growing second-hand market in these. There was also a lot of blue-stocking-inspired fuss around the noise and safety of motorcycles, plus increasing regulation with tests to pass, road tax to pay, and compulsory insurance. Moreover, quality control at British plants was generally accepted as rubbish. By 1936 alone, the industry had reportedly received some 10,000 letters of complaint from disaffected owners. But British bikes were admired around the world, proving themselves on the race circuits and especially at the Isle of Man TT. Even Il Duce Mussolini was pictured in the motorcycle magazine in 1929, flanked by British machines during one of his dictatorial drive-bys. Norton got a head start before the second spot of global bother, making military bikes from 1936. BSA provided around 126,000 M20 motorcycles to the Allied forces. As for Triumph, its Coventry factory got redesigned by the Luftwaffe on the night of November 14, 1940. But by 1943, it was back in production in an entirely new factory in Meriden, some 8 miles from the blitz-prone centre of Coventry. The Meriden factory would play a significant part in the motorcycle omnishambles that took place 30 years later. Normal relations resumed in 1945, with the big British Three looking set to profit from the coming boom times. And for a while, that was indeed the case. During much of the 1950s, more motorcycles were exported from Britain than from any other country in the world. Edward Turner's 500cc 1938 Speed Twin returned in 1947 and sold well into the 1960s, with regular upgrades and updates. It was a mainstay of Triumph's production during those years, and Triumph, after all, possessed what was probably at that point the most modern motorcycle factory in the world, Meriden, although other marques also benefited from the reversion of wartime shadow factories back to commercial use. Norton too was going in taters deep on twins, following the arrival of designer Bert Hopwood, who had assisted Edward Turner with the development of the Triumph Speed Twin in the 1930s. At its practically Victorian factory in Birmingham, Norton started production of its legendary Hopwood-designed Dominator parallel twin range in 1949, before Mr. Hopwood jumped ship yet again to BSA. Surprise, surprise, at BSA, Mr. Hopwood designed yet another parallel twin, kicking off what was to become BSA's Rocket and Golden Flash ranges in 1950. By the start of the 1950s then, the British motorcycle industry was pretty much placing most of its bets on air-cooled 500 to 650 cc's or thereabouts overhead valve parallel twins. Even the likes of Royal Enfield had jumped on the bandwagon. BSA, along with Triumph and Norton, also introduced a number of other sub-500cc models. Throughout the first half of the 1950s, the UK was, as I've said, the world's largest producer of motorcycles, and BSA was the world's largest motorcycle manufacturer. It would prove to be a winning formula, until it wasn't. Smaller machines and new purpose-built factories had begun to emerge from the rubble of Germany, Italy and Japan, where there was a demand for cheap and cheerful transport to help rebuild those nations. Another problem was that cars were getting cheaper too. You could buy a Ford Anglia for £541 in 1960, or you could save a whopping £8 by opting for one of Norton's 500cc twins. The Japanese were the first off the blocks with post-war scooters, the delightful little Fuji Rabbit and the Mitsubishi Silver Pigeon, and Italy's Vespas and Lambrettas weren't far behind, thereby setting the scene for the scooter boom, which spanned a decade from the late 50s to the late 60s. Ironic, as it had been the Brits who had first invented the scooter, then bungled it way back in the 1920s. BSA had drawn up a design for a scooter in 1946, but shelved it. By way of a riposte, BSA introduced the small two-stroke Bantam in the late 40s, after receiving the winner's spoils from German marque DKW, whose RT125 it was based on. Other German bikes they had their eyes on seemed to have been spirited away by the Americans before the Brits got to the factories. Still, the Bantam went on to become the single most successful British motorcycle of all time. During this period, BSA even catered for the wannabe biker cyclist with its clip-on winged wheel. But the Brits were late to the scooter rally and were left playing catch-up, although Douglas had been building Vespas under licence, and BSA displayed 2 lightweight scooters at the 1955 motorcycle show. The 70cc Dandy, which was plagued by problems when it went into production, and the 200cc Beezer, which never made it into production at all.
The Cycle and Motorcycle Show at Earl's Court drew record crowds on opening day.
However, the manufacturers had their hands forced to some extent when the UK government passed the 1960 Road Traffic Act, limiting learner riders to bikes under 250cc's. Another moral panic was brewing regarding the safety of motorcycles, with what the public perceived as carnage taking place on the UK's roads, scything away young men and frequently their young female pillion passengers as well.
Wear a helmet. Always.
Despite that, a view persisted in the upper echelons of the industry that there was little point in perfecting a modern, safe, trouble-free motorcycle, as according to Donald Heather, the managing director of AMC, most motorcyclists love to spend their Sunday mornings taking off the cylinder head and reseating the valves. The overriding perception of the market being that motorcyclists were enthusiasts who probably went to the racetrack at the weekends. But back to scoots. The infamous Triumph Tina, the brainchild of Edward Turner, who was by then long past his design-by date, arrived in 1962, following a mixed reception for another Turner production, the Triumph Tigress, also known as the BSA Sunbeam, a couple of years earlier. BSA had bought Triumph from its owner, Jack Sangster, 10 years earlier for a then-whopping $2.5 million in cash, nearly $70 million in today's money. So abysmal was the Tina's design that Mr. Turner himself suffered instant karma when he crashed into a curb and broke an ankle riding one. Not even an endorsement by Cliff Richard, the UK's anodyne answer to Elvis, could prevent it from being a sales disaster. Turner tried again in 1963 with the much-derided BSA Beagle, more of a traditional motorbike. Due to a poorly designed lubrication system, this 75cc 4-stroke single suffered oil leaks and engine failures, and consequently not many more than 3,000 were ever built.
Japan's 50cc Honda does 250 miles to the gallon.
Neither the Tina nor the Beagle were the kind of happy, carefree two-wheel experiences promised by, say, the Honda Cub, which debuted in 1958 and eventually went on to sell well over 100 million units, making it the biggest-selling motor vehicle in the world ever. By then, the kanji was on the wall. Turner himself had toured the Japanese motorcycle factories in 1960 and had seen the future, albeit through Union Jack-tinted glasses. He visited Honda, Yamaha and Suzuki. His report on the trip in September 1960 talks of the shocks I received on closer examination of the situation on their home ground. It was, he said, a somewhat frightening experience. The factories were modern. Honda's was only 3 years old at the time, built at a cost of £120 million in today's money. Turner was shown around by the younger Mr. Honda himself. The product was of a high quality.
The world's highest precision DOHC engines.
Much of the work that the Brits did by hand had been mechanised, using specially designed machine tools. The facilities were self-contained, making all their own castings, forgings and pressings. Turner commented that Japan was no longer copying Western products, they are designing from first principles. But, in words that would come back to haunt him, he concluded, I do not think the Japanese motorcycle industry will eclipse the traditional type of machine that the British motorcyclist wants and buys. Although he admitted the high quality and low prices of Japanese machines were bound to make some impact, and that it was a worry for BSA Triumph's export markets, where it was selling something like 30 to 40% of its output. His main concern seems to have been the extremely refined and well-finished motorcycles up to 300cc that were coming out of Japan. Turner was heading towards retirement at this point, although apparently nobody had the chops to tell him that. His long-held stated view was that excursions into difficult design projects and the accompanying expensive tooling risked what had been up to then very successful orthodox machines. Nipping at his heels was another legendary motorcycle designer, Bert Hopwood. Only 7 years Turner's junior, but with his eyes firmly set on future achievements rather than past glories. There was no love lost between Bert Hopwood and Edward Turner. Call it a personality clash if you like. Both were, by all accounts, quite stubborn, formal and opinionated individuals who seemed to have had very few kind words to say about each other. Hopwood once famously described Turner as the most egotistical man I have ever met. Turner was less technical and more of a stylist and publicist, while Hopwood was a rigorous engineer who often had to put what Turner had cobbled together right. Their design decisions, towering over the British motorcycle industry and spanning 5 decades, from the 1930s to the 1970s, inevitably played a role in its eventual demise. Mr. Hopwood only stayed a year at Norton before jumping ship to BSA in 1948, where fate in the form of his old nemesis, Mr. Turner, caught up with him again 3 years later, when BSA bought Triumph. He escaped again in 1955 and joined AMC's Norton until 1961, at which point he ended up back yet again with Edward Turner at BSA Triumph, on a promise that he would be Turner's successor, only to find himself stabbed in the back when the role went to Harry Sturgeon instead. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. Next time in part 2, I'll be donning my Austin Powers shirt and diving into the swinging 60s. By the start of the decade, the rot had already set in. Sales had slumped and workers were being laid off. British manufacturers were already going cap in hand to the government, begging for concessions and even hinting at subsidies. The Japanese were on the rise. Could the Brits muster much more than a headless chicken response? And what sowed the seeds of the disaster of the 1970s? Meanwhile, a monumental Three Phil's thank you to these kind folk who donated their fivers and tenors to the channel over the course of 2025. Without them, this video series would not have been possible. And don't forget, you can delve into many of the innovations the Brits were desperately coming up with to prevent their demise by having a dig around in the Three Phil's Motorcycles playlist. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, hyping and sharing to let YouTube know we're doing something right here at Three Phil's. Downhill and with the wind behind us, just like that day in 2005 when I got 176 miles per hour out of my ZZR 1400, Three Phil's might just reach the magic 10,000 subscriptions marker in 2026.